The Russian arms industry. At one point, it ranked second only to the oil and gas industry in terms of geopolitical prestige. In the years before the invasion of Ukraine, it averaged $15 billion in annual sales. But now, after years of war, it is a shell of its former self. Most analysis of the struggles of the Russian arms industry has focused on the consequences for the ongoing war. And obviously, that is an important part of the equation, especially if you are sitting in Kyiv in the middle of Moscow's crosshairs. But from the very start, the Kremlin has described the war as a battle between the East and the West. That being the case, we need to talk about why Moscow will still be feeling the pain for years, or even decades, into the future. And while long-term pain problems apply to a variety of topics, today's piece of the pie will be the arms industry's descent into darkness. To outline our deeper discussion of the trouble in Russia's arms industry, we will begin with the general strategy behind arms exports for any big player in the geopolitical field, which comprises both foreign policy influence and a virtuous cycle of more cash and better weapons. Then we will shift to how the war in Ukraine caused major problems across the industry for Russia, both as a consequence of battlefield performance and investment capacity. We will ultimately finish with how this is causing immediate reconfigurations to worldwide arms trade, with the United States all too happy to take advantage of the situation, and China perhaps situated to exacerbate the Kremlin's woes. But we begin with the general strategy of arms exports, as it relates to foreign policy influence. Let's say that you are a big country that produces a ton of weapons. Other countries are going to see your shiny collection and might ask you for a few. As a result, you get a standard economic market to form, where buyers and sellers meet to exchange goods at an agreed-upon price. But there are three things that make the weapons market distinct from standard economic trading. First is that the market is not all that competitive. Go back to the days of the Cold War, and things felt almost like a duopoly. You could either buy from the United States, or you could buy from the Soviet Union. The reason for this is that advanced weapons systems cost an incredible amount of money to produce. The only entities with enough financial resources to invest in them are large states, and thus you naturally get few producers. The second distinct quality of the market is that payment is not always in the form of cash. Selling states often want some sort of non-monetary compensation, usually in the form of political concessions. During the Cold War, that was a clear alignment to whichever bloc you were purchasing from, either the United States or the Soviet Union. Some of that has remained in the post-Cold War world. However, particularly on the Western side, it has evolved into concessions on democratic governance at home, or your promotion of the current geopolitical order more generally. This latter category is best seen in U.S. policy toward Israel's neighbors. The Cold War had the first hint of this with the Camp David Accords, where the Carter administration dangled U.S. arms sales as leverage to convince Egypt to normalize relations with Israel. But it recently accelerated with the Abraham Accords, which applied the same logic to a larger set of countries. This is why, when it comes to the arms trade, you cannot simply look at the price tag of weapons to get a lay of the land. A country may seem to be writing checks for weapons for pennies on the dollar, but they will ultimately pay for it somehow. Fair warning if you are a leader and you do not want to get a phone call late at night asking for a small favor. The final thing that sets the weapons market apart from traditional markets is issues with credible commitment. Handshakes alone will not enforce a deal in this world. Think about how negotiations work in a traditional business setting, with a consumer product design company, say borscht-producing chefs, and a manufacturing company that produces canned goods. The former needs the latter to make any money, and in fact knows that there is a huge market for borscht in Boris's Britain. But the manufacturer might not have enough capacity to suit the needs of the chefs. Maybe its warehouses got destroyed during the war, and the machines it has left over can only produce deformed cans. Further, it might also lack the capital to expand production capacity. But good news, those chefs are sitting on a ton of cash. So they simply invest to build out the production capacity, and now they can both make a ton of money. In contrast, think about business life in the wild, wild west. The chefs should have a serious concern here. Once the manufacturer builds out its production capacity, it could shift to a group of fancier rival borscht chefs, who are now offering more money to actually produce the finished cans. Fortunately, in any regular business setting, the solution is simple. Just write and sign a contract that prohibits that. The manufacturer knows that if it were to shred up the contract, the designer would take it to court, which would more than offset the riches offered by the rival company. The problem here for arms traders is that the field of international relations is more like the Wild West, and nothing immediately stops a recipient from doing whatever it wants after the shipment has already been received. But the concern here is somewhat overstated. The standard international relations solution applies, where new weapons flows are contingent on compliant behavior. Trying to move away from your original supplier is difficult, because it means juggling multiple systems. Just ask Ukraine about this with its mishmash of assistance that it received in the war. For example, when you have Soviet 152mm howitzers and NATO standard 155mm artillery shells, or vice versa. But breaking any agreement is often a bad idea, even if new weapons are not incoming. That is because the threats of breaking an agreement turn into a giant joke with a single, dreaded word: maintenance. To ground the idea, I want you to meet the United States' 114th Fighter Wing, which usually tries to avoid being grounded. For every 1 hour spent flying one of their F-16s, 33 man-hours go into maintenance. For a complex weapons system like that, unless your country can produce all of its components for maintenance, it is not a smart idea to turn on the seller's conditions. And if you can produce all of those components, then, well, why aren't you producing the whole weapons system for yourself? Not all sales will come with that same caveat. A howitzer, for example, requires less maintenance than an F-16, and those 155mm artillery shells from earlier just go into a tube and get fired. However, the big, valuable things do require upkeep, and that actually gives the seller further leverage. After the buyer has spent billions, the seller can simply cut ties, and pretty soon the investment will become worthless. So much for any plans of global domination. A similar problem arises if a vulnerability in a weapons system becomes public knowledge. The producer will want to find a patch for the vulnerability and get all of the systems updated, both in its domestic inventory and abroad. If you are out of political favor, though, well, so much for that. Sure would be a shame if your nice aircraft suddenly exploded. Worse, now everyone knows about the vulnerability, and knows that you have not fixed it. So you can imagine how your enemies will be going about their operations against you. All of this is to say that if you want to shape the world in your own image, it really pays to be an arms exporter. But it also helps with creating a virtuous cycle of money and better weapons. Think of your favorite weapon or weapons program, and you are probably familiar with some kind of ridiculous price tag associated with it. What is less obvious is how those costs are broken down. It turns out that a major problem with arms manufacturing is in research and development. These initial money drains are a part of the fixed costs of producing a weapon that have to be done before anything comes off of the assembly line. That includes steps like creating the aforementioned initial designs, constructing the factories that will produce the equipment, building and testing models, building true prototypes, and then testing those prototypes. Once you are done there, Only then can you begin producing the actual weapons. These are the marginal costs of production, the actual per-unit price tag once the system is up and running. They are still absurdly large from a humble academic's economic perspective, but they are relatively small compared to the fixed costs. Getting reliable figures on financial questions like these is difficult, because we are dealing in the obfuscating realm of national security. But the F-16 cost something along the lines of $70 billion in today's dollars to develop. However, even a top-of-the-line F-16 costs just $80 million to produce once it's up and running. What this means is that doubling the order of weapons does not double the cost of the program. Rather, it adds comparative peanuts to the final cost. Thus, the incentive for the arms manufacturer is to line up as many buyers as possible. But this creates a virtuous cycle. The more buyers that you have lined up, the more you can justify investing in R&D. The better the product that you produce, the more the buyers that you attract. The cycle begins anew. This is a more subtle reason why the market tends to coalesce around only a handful of suppliers. The other side benefit here is that you end up expanding your own manufacturing capacity well beyond what could be done with only domestic demand. So, in the event of your own war, you do not have to waste time building infrastructure. You just stop exporting the goods and have all of the assembly lines meet your needs for the conflict. This is also a subtle part of why Russia was so upset when former Eastern Bloc countries started to join NATO. It was not just a shift in the territorial chessboard. It was also that those countries were going to begin shifting to NATO-standard weapons. And with that, no further opportunities for Russia to export arms to them, and thus no receipts to keep the virtuous cycle spinning. The unfortunate reality, of course, is a virtuous cycle also implies a vicious cycle when things are going poorly. And that takes us to the struggles that Russian arms exporters are now facing, and will be facing years into the future. We can subdivide the woes into two categories: what third parties have learned as a consequence of the invasion, and the economic instability within Russia. The first category is a throwback to the beginning of the war, where expectations among even large-scale intelligence agencies were that Russia would get a quick win. That did not happen. The seemingly endless supply of malfunctioning military equipment painted a clear explanation as to why, and Ukraine was all too happy to set up public displays to remind anyone who may have forgotten. Now, some of that lesson is overblown. Much of the machinery itself worked just fine. Instead, we have discussed before how a lot of the failures were due to Russian personnel problems, which also led to equipment breakdowns from things like soldiers siphoning off the diesel, or stripping the metal to sell on the black market for their own personal gain. But some portion of it was, in fact, due to original shortcuts in the manufacturing process. You can imagine what the other countries were thinking. If Russia was skimping on their own product, what was it doing to ours? The other bit of learning had to do with sanctions. Russia's arms export industry was massive, yes, normally ranked second in the world only to the United States, $10.9 billion to $5.6 billion in 2019, though France had surpassed Russia by 2021. But Russia was not building raw input products. Not nearly enough of them, anyway. Rather, Russian arms manufacturers were importing base goods from the West. Things like semiconductors, which you may recall due to all the chaos involving them, mixing them with some domestically manufactured goods, and building a finished weapon. The problem here is that your whole supply chain is only as good as your weakest link, and the rust was about to become apparent. You see, if that link breaks because you have run out of, say, semiconductors, you cannot finish the product. Regarding the war in Ukraine, this meant that all of Russia's excess production capacity essentially went to waste. In other words, the earlier benefit created by that booming Russian arms export industry essentially vanished almost overnight. The casual viewer of the war likely found the result humorous, with Russia relying on North Korean weapons exports. For countries importing from Russia, however, it served as a new warning. If you order something from Russia, and for whatever reason the West decides that it is fed up with the Kremlin, you may not be getting your order on time, even if the West has no issue with you. Then there are the issues with economic instability in Russia. We have discussed these at length in the past, and it is worth remembering that Russia's central bank has done a remarkable job in keeping the country from imploding until there was nothing left. But the steps taken to avoid a disaster have left the economy hamstrung. Let's backtrack to the workflow of a weapons program. It is Step 1, pay exorbitant upfront costs to do the R&D for the new weapons. And then Step 2, pay still very high costs per unit of finished output. What this means is that there is often a decade or more in delay between the initial outlay and the return on the fruits of your labor. For example, the vaunted HIMARS launcher had its proof-of-concept prototype constructed in 1991, apparently before the advent of color photography. But contracts for the initial production did not come to pass until 2003. Consequently, if you are broke, you cannot really do Step 1, which means you never get the chance to do Step 2. In addition, Russia experienced a modest flight of its citizens as soon as the war started, especially among those who feared what sanctions would do for their economic prospects. Then Russia experienced a much larger flight the following September due to the broader mobilization, as able-bodied Russians realized they might be sent to the front lines in Ukraine. But this caused a big problem for the Kremlin. People wanted out, and those who had the means to leave disproportionately skewed toward the educated. It turns out that this is the type of people you need to build a next-generation weapons system. Eventually, casualties may start causing problems with the workforce more generally, though we are still a long way from that, despite some eye-popping numbers. Meanwhile, Russia's limited budget right now means that the Kremlin's own incentives are to not invest in more sophisticated weaponry, but rather to produce more weapons that can win right now. Let's combine all of these problems together, and fast forward about 5 years. Now, it is not like Russia is going to be incapable of offering arms exports. Rest assured that you will still be able to get the president on the line and have weapons at your doorstep in a mutually agreed-upon timeframe. Rather, it is that what Russia will have to offer will be worse than what the other arms exporters will have available. This technology gap problem is nothing new for Russia. Some form of it has been around since the fall of the Soviet Union. But there is only so far that it can drop off before the market goes elsewhere. A more subtle problem that will crop up is the structure of the export agreements. Remember the old joke of how Russia is an oil company that masquerades as a country? Well, there is a related argument that Russia's arms exporting industry is actually a bank in disguise. An analogous case that you might be familiar with is with car dealerships. Yes, they sell vehicles, though probably not those. Then again, I have not gone used car shopping in Moscow for a while. In any case, a good portion of a dealership's profits comes from the financing that is tied to many purchases. This is also the system that Russia often uses, especially because many of their regular buyers are poorer countries that may be unable to pay the sticker price up front. If you do not offer a payment plan, then all of that business will go away. Consequently, under normal circumstances, Russia instead bears the burden of the production cost up front, and then receives a steady stream of payments over time from the importer to compensate for that investment. But the war means that Russia has demands for cash now, so playing the role of a lender no longer looks as attractive. And if Russia can no longer offer financing, then those purchasers may go elsewhere. Cue the vicious cycle one more time. And that takes us to the damage, and how two other arms exporters can take advantage. India is a critical starting point. After all, it is Russia's #1 importer. In 2021, which I will frequently reference because that was the final year before Russia invaded Ukraine, India purchased $1.46 billion of Russian weapons. Note here that I'm using CPRI trend indicator values for this video. This is a complicated way to assign true dollar figures to the goods traded, which is not easy to do given that actual contracts sometimes offer the sweetheart deals that we discussed earlier. There is the short version of the official reasoning. Have fun reading it if you are so inclined. Okay, back to that $1.46 billion of Russian weapons to India in 2021. For perspective, Russia did $2.86 billion in total arms exports that year. Russia's main problem is that India is flexible. Yes, India is a member of the BRICS partnership. However, the West does not have any major geopolitical problems with India. Okay, there are some issues, but the West still sees India as a strategic partner in counterbalancing China. You can observe this in the arms export data. From 2016 to 2021, Russia exported $9.06 billion in weapons to India. Meanwhile, France exported $4.12 billion, Israel $2.01 billion, the United States $1.80 billion, South Korea $434 million, the United Kingdom $314 million, Germany $286 million, and a handful of others at what we might call negligible amounts, but in reality would buy hundreds and hundreds of houses. Combine those together, and they are basically at parity with Russia. The point is that India is perfectly happy to embrace alternative weapon streams. Even before the invasion, India had a growing frustration with Russia's inability to meet its goals, notably canceling plans to co-develop Su-57 stealth fighters. The war has only worsened the situation, with Russia missing deadlines as a consequence of needing to reorient its industry for the war effort. And India is not alone with its frustrations. Egypt, the Philippines, and Indonesia have similarly shifted priorities. The one hope here is that Russia has been sending India the oil that the West has sanctioned since the beginning of the war. However, because the West has hampered Russia's bargaining position, India has been paying for that oil in rupees. But this presents a problem for the Kremlin. Put simply, Russia does not import nearly enough from India to counter the trade imbalance, and Western sanctions prevent Russia from just using the standard currency markets to try to convert that money into something more useful. Russia has therefore chosen to reinvest the money into India, conceivably with the hope of eventually cashing out when the geopolitical circumstances become more favorable. One way to do this faster would be to use the rupees to pay Indians to build Russian armaments to go to Ukraine. Whew. And yes, I realize the irony of the trade deficit turning India into an arms exporter to Russia. However, the discussions to put such a scheme into place are happening. The risk for India, of course, is having those Western sanctions extend to the subcontinent as a consequence. Meanwhile, the United States has been happy to try to accelerate tepid Russian partners to switch to Western weapons. The images that you are seeing now are not from some sort of alternative history, where the US won the war, Vietnam became the 51st state, and Richard Nixon became so popular that they repealed term limits. No, that is Biden there, on a state visit to Vietnam in September 2023. Back while he was vice president, the United States tried to stretch out its influence in the region by ending an embargo on arms sales to Vietnam. 7 years later, Biden stopped by on a broader trip meant to expand the coalition to combat China. The Vietnam visit actually followed an earlier stop in, guess where? India. The subtext here was arms and ideological alignment. The era of the Vietnam War was behind them. Both Hanoi and Washington want to deter China, something that Russia is not as interested in doing. It is a not-so-veiled pitch to switch arms suppliers to the United States. After all, if you are Vietnam, and suddenly you go to war with China, armed with Russian weapons, how confident are you that you are going to receive help with your materiel? Now repeat that same thought process with American weapons, and you can see the appeal of this pitch to Vietnam. Speaking of China, you have another government, this time in Beijing, attempting to take advantage of Russia's missteps. Once upon a time, China was Russia's largest arms importer. From 2000 to 2006, receipts averaged $2.5 billion annually. But from 2010 to 2021, the average dropped to $849 million. The reason for this evolution was the growth of China's domestic arms industry, thereby supplanting the need to go elsewhere. Chinese arms exports have correspondingly increased, primarily in the form of becoming Pakistan's main supplier. The major risk for Russia is China becoming the default exporter for countries aligned against the United States. That was always Russia's main comparative advantage, and if it disappears because China steps up, so too does that virtuous cycle that Russia otherwise has taken advantage of. Of course, China has its own quality questions to answer. Nigeria grew frustrated with downtime of its F-7 imports. Myanmar had similar problems with its JF-17s. For Bangladesh, it was the K-8W. Even Pakistan has found its own difficulties with F-22P frigates. Feels a bit like we are playing alphanumeric soup here, but the key point is that buyer beware reigns once more. The thing is that military hardware is sophisticated, and it is hard to tell when it might fall apart. That stands in contrast to something like a book, which relies on basic technology that goes back centuries. Thanks, Gutenberg. For example, you could reliably check out my new book on the strategy of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or go straight to the original analysis of lines on maps. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. We saw a bunch of blueprints earlier. Oddly enough, I pulled these from NORAD's Santa tracking project. I did not even realize what I was doing until I hit the last one. Cool.